Just before dawn on March 21st, 1804, a young French prince stood in a freshly dug ditch with his hands tied. He was Louis Antoine Henri de Bourbon-Condé, the Duke of Enghien, the last heir of the legendary House of Condé. He'd been kidnapped from another country, dragged across the border, and put through a sham trial in the middle of the night. Now, in the flickering light of a few lanterns, he was facing a line of French soldiers, their muskets aimed right at his chest. The order for this execution came from the most powerful man in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. So, how did a minor royal, living a quiet life in exile, become the focus of an emperor's paranoia? How did he end up here, in the cold, damp moat of the Château de Vincennes, staring into his own grave? This isn't just the story of a political hit. It's a story of conspiracy, a brutal violation of international law, and a calculated act of terror meant to secure an empire. To understand this act, which would forever stain Napoleon's legacy, we have to go back to a France simmering with plots, where one man's fate got tangled up in another's ambition. The year is 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte is the first consul of France, the undisputed master of the Republic. But his power, while huge, isn't totally secure. The French Revolution had left the nation exhausted by a decade of chaos and bloodshed. Napoleon brought order, sure, but his rule was built on a shaky foundation. He wasn't born a king. He was a product of the revolution who had risen on merit. And because of that, he was surrounded by enemies. On one side were the radical Jacobins, who saw him as a tyrant betraying the revolution. On the other, and much more organized, were the royalists. These were the nobles and aristocrats who had fled France and now dreamed of putting the Bourbon monarchy back on the throne. From their safe havens in London and Germany, they plotted, bankrolled by Napoleon's greatest enemy, Great Britain. For Napoleon, these royalist plots were more than just a political problem. They were a deeply personal threat. In 1800, he'd barely survived an assassination attempt known as the Infernal Machine, a bomb that exploded just moments after his carriage passed, killing several bystanders. The incident left him with a deep-seated paranoia, a belief that his enemies would stop at nothing. He saw assassins everywhere and was convinced the Bourbons were pulling the strings from afar. And this is where the Duke of Enghien enters the story. Born in 1772, he was a prince du sang, a prince of the blood. When the revolution broke out, his family fled. Following the military tradition of his family, the young duke took up arms against the French Republic, fighting for the émigré army. He didn't see it as treason. He saw it as a fight to restore the rightful king and bring order back to his home. After the émigré armies were disbanded in 1801, the duke wanted a quiet life. He settled in Ettenheim, a town in the German state of Baden, right across the Rhine from France. There he lived peacefully, devoted to the woman he loved, Princess Charlotte de Rohan, whom he may have secretly married. He spent his days hunting in the Black Forest. He was, for all intents and purposes, retired. But three things would seal his fate. He was a Bourbon prince, he had fought against France, and he lived temptingly close to the border. In Napoleon's paranoid mind, that made him a perfect target. The Duke's quiet life was about to come to a violent end. In August 1803, a group of men dropped off by a British ship landed secretly on the coast of Normandy. Their leader was Georges Cadoudal, a tough and fanatical royalist. His mission, funded by the British, was brutally simple: kidnap or kill Napoleon Bonaparte and spark a coup to restore the monarchy. This plot became the fuse that led straight to the Duke of Enghien's grave. Cadoudal was joined by other high-profile figures, and for months they moved through Paris in the shadows, waiting for their moment. But Napoleon's police, led by the ruthlessly efficient Joseph Fouché, were closing in. In early 1804, they started unraveling the conspiracy, arresting one plotter after another. Under interrogation, some of them broke. They revealed the plan and, crucially, mentioned they were waiting for a French prince to arrive and lead the movement after Napoleon was out of the way. They didn't know which prince. But for Napoleon, this was a bombshell. It confirmed his worst fear, that the Bourbons themselves were directing the assassination plots. He became obsessed with finding this prince. The main Bourbon heirs were far away in Poland or England, but then his advisors guided his gaze to the young Duke of Enghien, living just across the river in Ettenheim. The evidence connecting Enghien to the plot was flimsy, practically non-existent. He wasn't involved. The intelligence reports were a mess of bad information and outright lies. But Napoleon wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a scapegoat. The Duke was a Bourbon. He had fought against France, and he was within reach. On March 10, 1804, Napoleon held a council with his top ministers, including the cunning Talleyrand and the police minister Fouché. Both men, for their own reasons, encouraged Napoleon's fury. Talleyrand wanted to prove his loyalty, and Fouché saw a chance to create a permanent split between Napoleon and the Royalists. In that meeting, the decision was made. They would violate German sovereignty, kidnap the Duke of Enghien, and make a terrifying example of him. Napoleon's fear had found its victim, and the hunt was on. The order was given with chilling speed. A detachment of French dragoons was sent to cross the Rhine, surround the Duke's home in Ettenheim, and grab him. This was a massive breach of international law. The Duchy of Baden was a neutral country. To send armed troops across its border was basically an act of war. But Napoleon was past caring about diplomacy. He wanted his prince. On the night of March 14, 1804, French soldiers snuck across the river in the dark and surrounded the Duke's small home. Inside, Enghien was asleep. He'd been warned about suspicious men lurking nearby, but had brushed it off. He couldn't believe the French would dare kidnap him on neutral ground. He couldn't have been more wrong. The soldiers stormed the house and quickly overpowered the Duke and his small staff. He was captured, bound, and taken on the long, ominous journey toward Paris, with no idea what crime he was even accused of. At this point, the Duke was still sure it was all a terrible mistake. He believed that once he had a chance to speak with Napoleon and explain himself, he'd be set free. He wrote letters insisting he was innocent of any assassination plot and repeatedly asked to see the first consul, a request that was cruelly denied every time. He had no idea his fate was already sealed. While the Duke was still being transported, Napoleon had already decided he would be shot. A decree was published charging him with bearing arms against the Republic, receiving funds from England, and plotting against the security of the Republic. The legal machine for a state-sanctioned murder was already in motion. General Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law, was put in charge of the process in Paris. The trial was set for the ancient imposing Château de Vincennes. Another general, Anne-Jean-Marie René Savary, one of Napoleon's most loyal men, was sent to Vincennes with clear orders. Make sure the Duke is executed without delay. There would be no appeal, no mercy, and definitely no meeting with Napoleon. The first consul wanted it done fast and quiet. As the Duke of Enghien's carriage rattled towards Paris, he wasn't traveling to a hearing. He was traveling to his execution. The Duke of Enghien arrived at the Château de Vincennes late on the evening of March 20th, 1804, exhausted and cold from the journey. He was led into the grim fortress, a place where two of his own ancestors had been imprisoned centuries before. He was probably still clinging to the hope of a fair hearing, a chance to clear his name before Napoleon himself. That hope was a fantasy. The moment he passed through the gates of Vincennes, his life was over. A military commission of 7 colonels had been thrown together, presided over by a General Hulin. These were soldiers, not judges, and they were there to follow orders, not to pursue justice. The questions they would ask had been written in advance by Napoleon. The deck was stacked. The outcome was certain. The trial was set to begin at 1 o'clock in the morning, a sinister detail that shrouded the whole affair in secrecy. As the Duke waited, the final preparations for his murder were underway. A grave was already being dug in the castle's moat. General Savary, Napoleon's enforcer, was there to make sure nothing went wrong. His job was to shut down any last-minute appeals or delays. He was the embodiment of Napoleon's cold, unbending will. The interrogation began. The Duke had no lawyer, no one to defend him. He was alone, facing a panel of officers who already had their orders. He answered their questions with the direct honesty of a soldier. Had he fought against France? Yes, he admitted it, as part of the émigré army. Did he get money from England? Yes, he was on a pension from the British, like most émigrés who had lost everything. But he furiously denied the main charge, that he was part of any plot to kill Napoleon. He knew nothing about Pichegru or the Cadoudal affair. Before he signed the record of his interrogation, he wrote one last, desperate plea at the bottom of the page. I urgently ask to have a private audience with the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a plea that would never be answered. The presiding officer, General Hulin, was reportedly moved by the request and suggested they grant it. But General Savary immediately cut him off. Their business, he said, was done. The time for talking was over. The story of the Duke of Enghien is a stark reminder of how personal fear can drive political cruelty, and it remains one of the most controversial acts of Napoleon's career. If you appreciate these explorations into the tough moral choices of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's next. The military commission quickly found the Duke guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death. The verdict was a formality. The legal justification was a twisted revolutionary law, and the fact that the Duke had been arrested in Germany, not France, was a detail they simply ignored. There was no pause, no time for appeal. Laws at the time said an execution couldn't happen before sunrise, but that was ignored too. General Savary was in control now. A firing squad of gendarmes was assembled. An official led the Duke from the trial chamber. When Enghien asked where they were going, the official grimly replied, "Sir, please follow me and summon all your courage." He was led down a dark, winding staircase and out into the cold night air, into the deep, dry moat of the fortress. There, by the dim light of a few torches, he saw it. A freshly dug hole, his own grave. The firing squad was lined up, waiting. The death sentence was read aloud to him one last time. He showed remarkable composure, no fear in the face of the terrifying reality. He had a few final requests. He asked that a lock of his hair and his ring be sent to his beloved Princess Charlotte. He asked for a priest. This was denied. He was offered a blindfold, but he refused it. Standing on the edge of his grave, he faced the soldiers, his countrymen, and said his final, haunting words. How terrible it is to die like this at the hands of Frenchmen. He knelt for a moment in prayer. Then he stood, ready. The order was given. A volley of musket fire tore through the darkness of the moat, and Louis-Antoine de Bourbon, the last Duke of Enghien, fell into his grave. It was in the early hours of the morning, between 2 and 3 a.m., on March 21st, 1804. The brutal act was complete. Napoleon had his revenge. This secret execution wasn't meant to stay secret for long. Napoleon wanted it to be a message, and that message was heard loud and clear, first in Paris, then across Europe. But the reaction wasn't just terror, it was profound shock and outrage. In Paris, the writer François-René de Chateaubriand bravely resigned from his diplomatic post in protest. But most of the French public, tired of plots and instability, stayed quiet. Napoleon himself declared, "At least they will see what we are capable of. I am the French Revolution, and I will defend it." The truly seismic reaction came from the royal courts of Europe. Kidnapping and executing a prince was seen as an act of gangster-like thuggery, unworthy of a head of state. Tsar Alexander I of Russia was especially furious. The Duke of Baden was his father-in-law, and Russia was a guarantor of the German states. He saw the act as a personal insult and a grave threat to the European order, ordering his court into mourning and immediately working to build a new coalition against France. Other monarchies were horrified but also scared. The King of Prussia, too afraid to condemn Napoleon directly, just expressed his hope that the horrible plot had been stopped. The Duke of Baden, whose country had been violated, simply kicked out other French émigrés to appease Napoleon. But privately, the act galvanized opposition. A famous phrase, though perhaps wrongly attributed, began to circulate that perfectly captured the political fallout. "It is worse than a crime. It is a blunder." The execution may have been effective at home, but it was a disaster for Napoleon's international reputation. He had shown the world he would break any rule, which only convinced his enemies he had to be stopped at any cost. The execution of the Duke of Enghien did what Napoleon wanted. It sent a brutal message to the Bourbons and their British backers. "Plotting against me will be met with death." The cycle of royalist assassination plots that had plagued him effectively ended. The act also served a purpose at home. By spilling the blood of a Bourbon, Napoleon signaled a final break with the old monarchy, showing revolutionaries he would never just hand power back to the kings. This act helped clear the path for his final transformation. Just 2 months later, Napoleon Bonaparte was proclaimed Emperor of the French. But the price for this security was a permanent stain on his legacy. The affair exposed the darkest side of his rule, a willingness to use state-sanctioned terror, to ignore law and justice for political gain, and to let his own paranoia drive him to murder. For many, it turned him from a brilliant general into a tyrant. Years later, in exile, Napoleon took full responsibility. He never showed remorse. In his will, he famously wrote, "I caused the Duke d'Enghien to be arrested and tried because that step was essential to the safety, interest, and honor of the French people. Under similar circumstances, I should act in the same way." For him, it was a harsh but necessary act of political survival. The story of the Duke of Enghien is more than just a historical footnote. It's a chilling case study in the nature of power, and it leaves us with an unsettling question. What terrible things can be justified in the name of national security? For Napoleon, the answer was clear. But for the young prince who died alone in a ditch, the answer was a horrifying glimpse into a new world where the old rules no longer applied.